An institution almost as big as its myth, the CIA. To get you started, here are a few of the true and untrue claims circulating around the world about what is probably the most famous agency in history. Number 1. The CIA overthrew elected governments and puppeteered dictators. That's true. Second, the CIA spied on American journalists. Also true. Number 3. The CIA contaminated the ghettos of Los Angeles with crack and had JFK assassinated. That's rather false. Number 4. The CIA had people kidnapped and tortured. Also true. Number 5. It cooperated with the mafia. Also true. And finally, number 6. The CIA let the HIV virus circulate. That's not true either. Even if not everything that is said about the CIA is true, it is significant to see that the agency is believed to be capable of almost anything. And so especially those who have something to hide themselves used the CIA's deeds and misdeeds as an argument for, let's say, actions in secret, as can be seen from the following example. When asked about possible interference by Russian intelligence forces in the 2016 US elections, Vladimir Putin usually responds with a mix of denials and countercharges. In an interview in 2017, he responded to the question of influence by saying that it was the United States that all over the world is actively interfering in electoral campaigns in other countries. This, of course, refers to the various interventions of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which is particularly notorious abroad in the affairs of other countries. These interventions range from the overthrow of left-wing governments to assassinations of disagreeable individuals to military operations and the deployment of America-friendly collaborators. Of course, by bringing this up, Putin wants to deflect attention from himself, change the subject and tell American journalists that you Americans are not better and need to look at your own history. And even if the intention behind this rather clumsy diversionary maneuver is clear to see through and the accusation is perhaps no longer necessarily relevant, the USA has to face up to the argument. For decades, the CIA, which is often described by skeptics as the uncontrolled private army of the American president, waged a clandestine campaign against enemies in the name of its government. But even the friends of the USA were not safe from the long hand of the Secret Service. They spoke of freedom and democracy but brought dictatorships and war. Surprisingly, much of this dirty war has been publicized by the USA itself in recent years, and despite this, or perhaps because of it, there is a deep mistrust of America in geopolitical matters. Its reputation has been ruined for the time being, and this is largely due to the actions of the CIA. That's why I'm dedicating this video to the CIA and its most significant involvements. We start at the very beginning, of course. It all began with teething trouble. A gentleman does not read another man's mail, declared US Secretary of State Henry Stimson in 1929, forbidding his office to decode the telegrams of foreign diplomats. It was not until the Second World War that the United States set up a centralized foreign intelligence service. However, President Harry Truman mistrusted the clandestine power and the service was disbanded in 1945. Spying on other countries was a breach of values. Why do you even need an intelligence apparatus in peacetime? However, values soon had to be adjusted, as all other major powers already had such an instrument, and the fear that a second Pearl Harbor could occur at some point was deep-seated. Moscow had long maintained a powerful espionage apparatus, which succeeded in spying on the US nuclear program. In 1946, this foul play came to light and made those in favor of a reconciliation with the USSR look naive. This was one of the reasons why, on the 26th July 1947, Truman once again set up an agency to pool and evaluate the insights of the various mostly military intelligence departments, the Central Intelligence Agency. Shortly afterwards, when the communists were on the verge of an election victory in Italy, Truman authorized the CIA to spend $10 million from Black Fund to covertly place election advertisements, spread propaganda lies and pay crooks to tear down Communist Party posters. The result? Italy's Christian Democrats beat the left by a clear margin. A complete success, not for Italy, but against the Soviet Union and therefore for the USA. However, the agency still had to find a justification, a leitmotif, out of necessity, namely to catch up with Moscow. This motive was and still is today fear. Out of fear of advancing communism, an institutional monster is now being created, with the help of which the White House launches propaganda without having to take responsibility for the content and intervenes militarily without officially deploying armed forces. The means to an end are manipulation, breaches of the law and acts of violence, and are actually a betrayal of the ideals on which the USA was once founded. But as the first US President George Washington said, to thwart the plans of an arming enemy, nothing is more necessary than secret knowledge, and nothing is more more difficult to obtain. Until 1953, the year of Stalin's death, the CIA sent agents into the Soviet Empire to spy on army bases, airfields and nuclear facilities. The aim? To warn of an imminent attack in time. After Stalin's death, the acute fear of war subsides for the time being, but now the covert World War intensifies on other fronts. In the troubled colonies of the so-called Third World and in the emerging nations in the Middle and Far East. The CIA's first major mission soon follows, Operation Ajax, the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The CIA's mission to get rid of the madman in Tehran. This madman is a 71-year-old eccentric aristocrat, an ardent patriot. He has succeeded in uniting the country, which is torn between radical fundamentalists and liberal, communists and monarchists, rich and poor, on one issue: the nationalization of the oil industry. For a long time, a large part of Iran's oil reserves were extracted by a British company. In other countries, such as Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, the oil nation and the producer split the profits 50-50, but not in Iran. Here, the British want to keep 80% of the profit. Mossadegh, therefore, expropriates the British oil company. London reacts more than angrily. After all, the semi-state-owned company is the largest British capital investment overseas. Britain therefore imposes a trade embargo, plunging Iran into economic chaos. But Mossadegh still holds on to the expropriation. The British now propose their plan to the USA. Mossadegh has to be overthrown with the help of the secret services and an authoritarian regime established, which the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is to lead as Iran's royal head of state. The British hit a nerve with the Americans when they spoke of the alleged communist threat. Mossadegh would move closer to Moscow, they said. So they are immediately persuaded. Fear always works. The British and Americans work hand in hand, bribing members of parliament, religious leaders and military officers. They circulate propaganda in the form of vilifying articles and caricatures. Rumors are spread that Mossadegh would hand the country over to the communists, abolish the monarchy and with it Islam. And of course they persuade the Shah to join their side. The overthrow succeeds. The Shah is installed in Tehran and becomes sole ruler. Purges begin and a dictatorship is established, whose notorious secret police Savak is also trained by the CIA. The seriously ill Mossadegh is convicted and later dies under house arrest, and the British oil company returns. The US State Department is delighted with the success and is certain that it has found an effective weapon against communism, the CIA. The 1950s saw an increase in covert CIA operation, particularly in Latin America and Asia. Covert action appeared to be a universal cure, a third option between open war and diplomatic helplessness. Particularly in the Western Hemisphere on the American continent, the agency fights left-wing politicians by any means necessary. In Guatemala, for example, it overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman because he had expropriated the land belonging to the US United Fruit Company and distributed it to poor farmers. I mean, how dare he? Guzman is then replaced by the dictator and American puppet Carlos Castillo Armas. This is what a dictator should look like. These CIA successes, such as the regime change in Iran and the coup in Guatemala, blinded those responsible to failures until hubris led to what was probably the CIA's greatest failure in 1961. You know where I'm going. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution ended with the victory of the rebels led by Fidel Castro over the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The island of Cuba is too close to the zone of influence for American taste to allow a communist to rule here. And in addition, this communist also expropriated US agricultural companies as part of a land reform. The young president, John F. Kennedy, takes the advice of his predecessor, Eisenhower. The USA must act and remove the Cuban government around Castro. Eisenhower knows from his own experience how useful the CIA can be. In 1960, he approved CIA plans to assassinate the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, because it was feared that he would bring his country, which happened to be very rich in natural resources, closer to the Soviet Union. The plan was already in place and the successor, Joseph Mobutu, was ready and waiting to be paid generously for his betrayal of Lumumba. But officers of the former colonial power Belgium beat the Americans to it and have Lumumba shot. The CIA is trusted. It has enough successes to show for itself. Though Kennedy agrees, get rid of Castro. The attempted overthrow becomes a disaster for the USA. The entire operation is so arrogant and careless, and it also publicly fails, raising loud doubt for the first time about the professionalism of the CIA, its legitimacy and its methods. But despite this embarrassment, Kennedy knew that he could not do without the agency, and so he soon took back control of the CIA and its useful instruments. For a long time, the USA allowed its ally, Rafael Trujillo, who ruled the Dominican Republic as a brutal and corrupt dictator, to have his way. The US Secretary of State even said of him, He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Until he was no more than a son of a bitch, because in 1961 Kennedy gave the order to eliminate the once courted tyrant. The CIA thus remains useful to the American government as long as it is coordinated and works in secret. From then on, communication and coordination were to guide the agency. In 1961, the CIA was given a new headquarters in Langley, near Washington. One CIA man remarked at the time that the new building would turn the naughty lady into a respectable woman, and that he was afraid of too many memos, too many meetings, and not enough dirty work. Secret Service work is now becoming a sober, coldly calculating business. One of the new agency's goals is to gather information, everything it can get its hands on, because everything can be useful. Who is doing what in a country? Where are dissatisfactions and conflicts that can be exploited? Thus, a publicly accessible soil survey of a certain stretch of desert near Tehran show whether the density of the sand is sufficient to support a landing helicopter. You understand what I'm getting at, but not everything is legal. Radio and radar signals are intercepted, telephones are tapped, letters are secretly opened, spy planes are being developed that fly above the range of surface-to-air missiles, but also, for example, mini microphone implants in the chests of pigeons that are trained to perch on the windowsills of embassy buildings. So the CIA is becoming more efficient and intelligent. Everything is more institutionalized and structured, but some things are still hidden and only intended for the White House. The debacle in Cuba in 1963 was still shaking the CIA to the core, which is why major paramilitary operations were avoided for the time being, with one exception: Indochina. The agency trained troops in Laos and South Vietnam in particular, as the spread of communism in the tropics was also to be prevented at all costs in line with the domino theory. In the mid-1950s, the independent states of Laos and Cambodia emerged from the French colony in Indochina, as well as the provisionally divided Vietnam. The North was communist, while the extremely corrupt Ngo Dinh Diem, who had previously made a name for himself as an anti-communist and anti-colonial nationalist in exile in the USA, ruled the South from 1955. For the CIA, he was the right candidate to rule South Vietnam as president. Initially, Diem was financed by the Americans with generous subsidies. The fact that he had thousands of supposed political opponents killed, including even Buddhist monks, and was therefore deeply hated by the people, was of little interest to Washington. It is only when Diem himself becomes a security risk for the USA that the protégé is dropped. With the backing of the White House, the CIA finances his overthrow. The bizarre thing is that the coup plotters claimed that the murdered Diem shot himself with his hands tied. But this was not to be the CIA's last mission in Vietnam. We jump to 1968. The agency survived Kennedy, although some even believed that the CIA itself was the mastermind behind the assassination attempt on the president. In any case, they now have to arrange themselves with Lyndon B. Johnson. That year, the USA is already at war in Vietnam. Johnson wants victory at any cost, be it money or human life. Nothing less than the credibility and threat potential of the USA was at stake here. So the CIA must get to work. Hundreds of employees are already operating in Vietnam, not only in the war zone but also in neighboring countries. In order to cut off supply routes, CIA instructors exploit an old ethnic antagonism. They are building a counter-guerrilla force of more than 40,000 men among the hill tribes, attacking North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters as well as Laotian communists. A CIA agent even pays out $1 to anyone who presents a cut-off ear as proof that a rebel has been killed. In order to obtain more information, Operation Phoenix is launched in 1968. Among other things, interrogation centers are set up in which prisoners are brutally tortured and murdered. I won't go into the torture method, otherwise this video will also be blocked. But I can mention one method. Sometimes a US Navy Special Forces unit would take 3 detainees at a time into a helicopter and interrogate them in the air. Unsatisfied with the result, the interrogators would throw the first out, then the second, until the third one started talking for his life. Rarely did it save him, and so in the end he too was thrown into the abyss. At least 20,000 people, probably considerably more, were murdered by the CIA-led squadron. In 1973, the USA ended its involvement in Vietnam. In the same year that on the other side of the world in Chile, the social president Salvador Allende is overthrown in a military coup that results in him taking his own life. The coup, led by the tyrant Augusto Pinochet, is supported by the CIA. Now it is the next US President Nixon, together with Henry Kissinger, who gives the CIA the order. As much as the intervention in Chile is a success for the CIA, the Vietnam operation leaves the agency in shambles. It supported an imperial adventure, corrupted itself in the process, soiled itself, aligned itself with criminals, and still lost Now the CIA is slowly beginning its decline. Publicly humiliated, the agency is forced to reveal a number of secrets. Its assassinations of foreign leaders, the murders in Vietnam, experiments with mind-altering drugs on humans, infiltrations into civil rights movements and peace groups. So the CIA is a broken agency that can be trusted to commit any atrocity. 1979 is then a year of disaster. Iranian revolutionaries overthrow the Shah Reza Pahlavi, after which their leader Ayatollah Khomeini proclaims the Islamic Republic and declares the USA the Great Satan. In Nicaragua, socialist rebels, the Sandinistas, take power and promote left-wing movements in the rest of Central America. And in addition, the Red Army invades Afghanistan. The CIA had previously been tamed by Gerald Ford, but now a presidential candidate comes around the corner who demands in the election campaign that the CIA should be let off the chain again. And he wins. Ronald Reagan will honor his promise. Soon, the agency was smuggling special mines and anti-tank missiles into Afghanistan, where Muslim resistance fighters were using them against Soviet troops. Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein, who attacked Iran in 1980, received armaments, electronics, and access to secret data from American radar and satellite reconnaissance. In camps along the border with Honduras, the CIA arms and trains Nicaraguan counter-revolutionaries, the Contras. Public opinion and the American Congress wanted to be consulted on these actions, but neither Reagan nor CIA Director William Casey were prepared to give up the Covert War. What follows are secret affairs and intrigues that will link Central America to a cocaine epidemic in the USA. You heard that right, because the CIA's contact men are capitalizing on the war by combining it with arms and drug smuggling. The Contra leaders trade in cocaine so that they can buy weapons on their own. Cocaine consumption in the USA rises from 28 to 72 tons between 1979 and 1985. Tony Montana sends his regards. In this case, he is called Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and, at Casey's suggestion, secretly collected donations from conservative Americans for the Contras in Nicaragua. With this money, North bought weapons and delivered them to Central America, where the aforementioned cocaine also came from. But the ramifications extend even further than the cartels of Central and South America. They also reach the Middle East. In an effort to free US hostages, they agreed to a deal with Tehran in 1985. Despite an arms embargo, the US provided weapons to the Khomeini regime in exchange for the hostages. Oliver North, the guy involved in cocaine and weapons smuggling, you remember, was supposed to take the lead in the deal. I mean, what could go wrong? In secret, more than 2,000 tanks and 18 surface-to-air missiles were brought to Iran, and at inflated prices. North made around $30 million, while the purchase price was only $12 million. North stored the $18 million difference in Swiss accounts. An ever-expanding network of government insiders, front companies, mercenaries, criminals, and CIA contacts emerges, becoming an uncontrolled shadow power of US foreign policy. It is unclear how much Reagan and Casey knew about it, but the depth of the affair were revealed at the end of 1986, which was called the Iran-Contra affair. Whoever was involved or had knowledge of the affair, in the end, Oliver North was the only legitimate scapegoat. Now you may be wondering what terrible punishment he received for his shadow dealings. The poor man had to perform a few hours of community service, and the remaining sentence was dropped. Oh well, justice. Nowadays he works as a military historian and radio and TV host. Never mind, we have to go back to the year 1989, the year the Soviet Empire collapsed. So where was the CIA here? Well, the US agency did not alert the US government in time to the internal decay of the empire, as it was probably more occupied with drug and arms trafficking. So were the glory days of the CIA over? The monster that the CIA had by now become useless, missed its own purpose, and outlived its time. This is at least what the critics say, and then exactly what the CIA once wanted to prevent happened. Was the CIA asleep? Did they ignore or not take the threat seriously? Whatever it was, from now on things would move quickly. Just 2 weeks after the attack, the Jawbreaker team was in Afghanistan, searching for Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. The CIA is now being rearmed, its purpose restored, and its motive invoked once again. Fear. Not the fear of a second Pearl Harbor, but of a second 9/11. For this, even analyses are adjusted to fit the preconceived opinions of the client. And so the CIA soon presents President George W. Bush the next fatal misjudgment, evident that Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction and has close connections to Al-Qaeda. The justification for an invasion of Iraq. You know the rest. Since then, a lot has happened, and despite all the criticism, the CIA still exists. And covert operations still exist as well, but today the focus is more on cyber operations and drone warfare. The myths of the CIA remain unbroken. And through the mentioned operations in this video, one can get a glimpse of the intrigues, clandestine networks, and depth involved. The story goes much further back and is much bigger generally. The intelligence agency was already active in the Korean War and has been involved in coups and military operations in Syria since 1947. To the overthrow of Milosevic in Serbia in 2000 and so on, and so forth. Once you start researching, you never escape the rabbit hole. I hope that this brief chronicle could give you a good impression of the CIA's involvement throughout history. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to History Folks or leave a like.